Okay, so this morning we're talking about difficulties faced by translators. Why do we need translations? Well, frankly, we need them because you can't read that. Anybody want to take a stab at what those say? What are those? All right, so on the top is Genesis 1:1, and on the bottom is John 1:1. But you can't read those, and neither can I. So we have to have translations. Now, translating is really easy, right? I mean, you just find the Greek word and you find the English word that corresponds most nearly and you substitute the English word, right? I mean, how hard can that be? No, translating is extremely difficult, and you are probably aware of that, but this morning we're going to talk about some of the specific challenges that translators deal with. The purpose of a translator is primarily to do two things. One, faithfully render the text from the original language into the target language. Emphasis on faithfully render the text. And secondly, do that in a way that's clear and natural to the reader in the target language. Now, Jonathan, would you mind just passing these out to those who just came in? Thank you. All right. Now, there is an old Italian phrase, traditori, traditori. Those are two words that look very similar, but what that phrase means is translators are traitors. And the point of that expression is simply to say that when a translator is doing his work of translating, he will inevitably, to some degree, betray the meaning of the original. He has to, because languages across history, across culture, across geographic locations, languages are so vastly different that you can't just perfectly find parallels. And so inevitably, you will betray the meaning of the original. So here's an example. In Matthew chapter 26 and verse 41b, the second half of that verse, you have Jesus saying, "The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Now, as a fun exercise to illustrate the difficulty of translating, they took this passage to some common folk in Russia and said, translate this from English into Russian. And then they took that to English speakers and said, translate this from Russian back into English. Okay? English to Russian, back to English. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Here's what they came back with. The vodka is fine, but the meat is rotten. Now, you can see how they got there, right? Vodka is a type of spirit, right? Wine, alcoholic beverages are often called spirits, okay? So you can see that. Meat and flesh, you can see how that was connected. But that's not the idea of Matthew 26:41, is it? Of course it isn't. But what else do you see in here with that word vodka? Yes, you see that vodka is a type of spirit, but do you see a cultural influence here? Yeah. To the mind of a Russian, what is he going to think of when he sees the word spirit? Booze. Okay? I'm not denigrating Russians, by the way. I'm sure the people who did this were wonderful people. Okay, so, traditori, traditori. Translators are traitors. So let's talk about some of the specific challenges for translators. The first one to consider is word order and sentence structure. If you took the Greek text of the New Testament and you said, okay, I'm going to render this Greek text in English exactly the way it's written in Greek. Okay, that's fine, but you're going to present some difficulties like this. Here is a rendering of Acts 2:41 following the word order of the Greek. Then so those who had received word his were baptized, and there were added day that souls about 3,000. Now, can you make sense of that? Yeah, you can. You kind of have to do this a little bit, right, and squint and kind of think about it for a minute. But you also have to recognize this. You can probably understand that verse because you've read it 12 million times in English. Think about how much more difficult it would be if you did not have the English in your consciousness already. A literal rendering of 1 Peter 2 and verse 5. Also, sometimes this thing gets a little trigger happy. All right. Okay. Okay. Also you, as stones living, are being built, house, a spiritual, for priesthood, a holy, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Man, that just really doesn't flow naturally in English, does it? But this is the actual Greek word order. And this, yeah, we can understand it, but there's some difficulty and it doesn't flow easily for us. So you can't just take the Greek or the Hebrew word order and sentence structure and carry that over to the English. It's unnatural to the target language. Another thing to consider is the type of literature that's under consideration. That makes a big difference. Biblical literature falls into different genres or categories. You've got historical narrative, you've got poetry and apocalyptic texts like Revelation and portions of Ezekiel and Daniel. You have lots of prophecy in the Old Testament and the New Testament as well. Biblical poetry is especially difficult to translate. Jonathan, do you have the extras left over? Would you mind sharing that with me? Here's where you need that handout that I gave you at the beginning of class. Biblical poetry, thank you, is extremely difficult to translate. Now, before we even look at this handout, think about poetry in English, okay? Think about the poetic works of some of our famous English writers. All the way back to Shakespeare and even going up to more modern writers. Poetry often has a rhythm to it, right? It has a cadence. And poets will oftentimes use words that rhyme. They will use words of alliteration, words that start with the same letters. And when you're hearing that read, your ears pick up on that, right? You pick up on that rhythm. You pick up on the cadence of it. Well, biblical poetry was no different. When the Hebrews were listening to the books of poetry, there was often a rhythm, a cadence. Sometimes there was rhyming. There was a lot of alliteration that was used. The Hebrew listeners picked up on that. But how do you convey that in English? How do you convey the emotion that comes through poetry in another language? The Song of Solomon is a great example of this. Lots of emotion in the Song of Solomon. How do you convey that? How do you convey emotion in another language? It's very difficult to do. You also have alphabetic acrostical forms of poetry. Acrostical poems, such as Psalm 119, it is impossible to translate. And here's why. Look at the handout that I gave to you at the beginning of class. This is a photocopy of Psalm 119, the first several verses of Psalm 119 from a Hebrew-English parallel Bible that I have. Now, Hebrew reads from right to left, top to bottom, not left to right, okay? So you start here at the bottom of the right-hand page, 119. That's the beginning of Psalm 119. Notice right above the first verse in English, you have the Hebrew first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph. Now move over to the right side margin. You see that letter highlighted there at the top. And notice the first line begins with aleph. The word begins with that letter. Drop down to verse 2, the third line. You see the same letter. All right, now go to the left side of the page to the very top. You see it again, verse 3, verse 4, 5, 6. I've highlighted all of those for you. You see it's the same Hebrew letter in all of those highlighted words. Then you come down to verse 9, and now we go to the second Hebrew letter, bet. And verse 9 all the way down through verse 16, each verse begins with that Hebrew letter. You see that? Every word that's highlighted there starts with that letter. That will not translate to English. Because these same Hebrew words that are used, that are all spelled beginning with those letters, the perfectly corresponding English word may not start with B or A, right? How do you translate this? You can't. You can translate the words, but you can't keep the acrostical form. Okay? Now, if you're reading this in Hebrew, do you think you would have noticed that? That every other line begins with a word that starts with the same letter? That's alliteration. You would have picked up on that. You'd see it visually when you're reading this. In English, it just completely goes over us because translators can't do it. Now, they usually put in a footnote that says, oh, by the way, in Hebrew, this is an acrostic. And we go, huh? Okay? All right. There's several acrostics in the Bible. The book of Lamentations is also one of them. And there's a handful of them scattered throughout the Old Testament. All right. Idiomatic expressions and euphemisms. Idioms. We use idiomatic expressions all the time. The Bible does too. There's hundreds of them in the Scriptures. How do you translate those? Idioms do not translate well into other languages because idioms are culturally driven most of the time. And so if you're not from that culture, you're not going to understand the idiomatic expression. So here's an example. We talk about, man, I am really scraping the bottom of the barrel. What does that mean? It means we're empty, there's nothing left, there's no other alternatives. You know, somebody might call me and say, hey, Ben, our church would love for you to come preach for us. And I'd say, man, you're really scraping the bottom of the barrel. Meaning, couldn't you find somebody better? Couldn't you find someone else? If you're having to come all the way down here, that expression has a meaning to us. We understand it. And we could go back and trace its meaning and where it originally came from. But a West African country, you go talk about scraping the bottom of the barrel, they're going to say, what are you talking about? That makes no sense. I want to share with you an illustration that's kind of lengthy, but it's on the screen. You'll be able to follow along with this. I think this is really interesting. Here's a man who says nothing but idioms. My career had seen better days. I was skating on thin ice, scraping the bottom of the barrel, and ready to say uncle. The boss and I did not see eye to eye, and he told me to shape up or ship out. There was no silver bullet. It was a safe bet I was going to sink or swim. Nobody could save my bacon. My smart aleck colleague was a stick in the mud and a snake in the grass who would sell me down the river as soon as shake a stick at me. I could smell a rat, so I steered clear of him. I had one slim chance. It was a shot in the dark, but if I could keep a stiff upper lip, stick to my guns, and sail close to the wind, I would get a second chance. The saving grace was that at the last minute, I got a second wind and was saved by the bell. Now listen, every single word in that illustration is an idiomatic expression, but you understood exactly what he was saying. But you can't translate that into Mandarin and expect it to make any sense. Okay? I remember years ago I was preaching in Honduras and preaching through a translator. I speak a little Spanish, but not enough to preach an entire sermon. And I used the expression, it's a piece of cake. And the man who was translating, he stopped and he just looked at me. What does that mean? How do I translate that, right? Of course, I know what that means, but he had no idea. So here's some examples of some biblical idioms. The Bible in the Old Testament talks about a land flowing with milk and honey. What does that mean? It means it's fertile. It's a productive, bountiful, abundant land. Nobody literally thinks that milk is flowing through the streams, right? All right, how about this one? Exodus 34:6 talks about how God has a long, hot nose. Now, if you look in Exodus 34 and verse 6, it says that God is long-suffering. Why doesn't it say he has a long, hot nose? That's what the Hebrew words actually say. God has a long, hot nose. That was a Hebrew idiom for patience, long-suffering. In Matthew chapter 1 and verse 18, the Greek literally says that Mary is having it in the belly. A Greek idiom for pregnant. 1 Peter 1 and verse 13, Peter said, "Gird up the loins of your mind." Prepare your mind is the idea. In fact, a lot of newer translations, instead of saying gird up the loins of your mind, instead of just translating that idiom, they say prepare your minds for action, because that's what it means. Euphemisms present some challenges, not as much as idioms, but still challenges. Euphemisms are, as you know, culturally appropriate ways of saying things that might otherwise be considered too direct or too vulgar or inappropriate for conversation. So we read in Genesis 4 and verse 1 that Adam knew his wife. Well, I know my wife. We've been married 14 years. Yeah, that's not what it means, is it? Adam knew his wife. It's talking about sexual relations. Or 1 Samuel chapter 24 and verse 3, King Saul goes into a cave and he covered his feet. Anybody know what that means? He relieved himself in the cave. He went to the bathroom. It's a euphemism for urination. It just seems a little crass to say King Saul went and urinated in the cave. So they put in a euphemistic expression. We might say today, hey, nature's calling. We know what that means, but we don't want to be crass and insensitive and say, I really have to go and urinate. Okay. Okay, right? Okay. Lexical problems. Word usage problems is what that means. A word can have numerous meanings and numerous uses. What do you think about the English word ball? Ball. How many meanings do you think there are to the English word ball? Can we banter a little bit and think of some?
It could be a dance.
A dance. So Cinderella went to the ball. Okay, what else?
The ball of your foot.
I'm sorry?
The
The ball of your foot. Okay.
A baseball.
Sports.
All right, sports, a ball, a game that you play with. Hey, let's go play ball. Okay, what else?
Emotional outburst or
Someone who's having an emotional outburst, right? She's bawling. Okay, what do we mean by that? Well, she's crying. She's really upset. Okay, what else? You can have a ball, right? You can have a fun time. Okay, we're missing the most obvious one. Yeah. Okay, balling up, using it as a verb. You're balling up a piece of paper to throw it in the trash can. Okay, that's good. We're still missing the most obvious one.
Don't drop the ball.
Okay, don't screw it up, right? Don't drop the ball. They're still missing the most obvious one. A spherical object, right? The earth is a big ball in the sky, right? Okay, just within a minute, we put together 8 or 9 different uses of the same English word. This happens in translation as well. You see this illustrated with the Greek word megas or mega, we say in English. This is where that comes from, mega. Okay, megas means great. Okay, look at Luke chapter 23 with me. This is when Jesus is having his trials with Pilate. And Pilate brings him out before the crowd, and the people are shouting in verse 21, "Crucify him." And Pilate says, why? What evil has this man done? Now, verse 23 says, the people were insistent with mega voices. Megos is the Greek word that's used there. Your translation says loud. Well, why does it say loud? Because the word means great. The word megos means great. Well, in English, when we talk about people having great voices, what do we mean? Tone. Beautiful voices. Oh, she has a great voice. She's a good singer. Megos, great, doesn't mean quality. It means volume. Great voices in the sense of volume. They were shouting with loud voices. That's what the Greek word means. How do you translate that? Well, you could say great voices. But people might say, oh, when they were shouting for Jesus to be crucified, it must have sounded so pleasant. No, we have to change the word. But there's other passages where this Greek word megos is used. Look in Matthew chapter 27. After Jesus is crucified, he is placed into the tomb of Joseph. In Matthew 27 and verse 60, Joseph takes his body and laid it in his own new tomb in which he had hewn out in the rock, and he rolled a megos stone against the entrance of the tomb. What does your translation say? Large. Okay? Does it say great? Okay. There, the megos, the word megos, great, it can work. You get the idea. A great stone, a large stone, but many translators choose not to say great. They say large instead. Okay? How about another example? John chapter 6. This same Greek word is used. John 6 and verse 18, talking about the winds that came upon the disciples when they were in the boat. John 6 verse 18, the sea began to be stirred up because a megos wind was blowing. What does yours say? Strong wind was blowing. Again, the Greek word, if you just translate it directly, great wind, okay, we'll get the sense. We'll get the idea there. That can work. But the translators said, it might be better to use the word strong instead of great. Okay? All right. You probably know that the Greeks had they had at least 4 words for love. Right? You had a word for romantic love. You had a word for brotherly love. We have a city in Pennsylvania that is named from that transliteration of that Greek word, Philadelphia. You have a word for a very erotic and sensual kind of love, eros, erotic. You can see how those words are related. And then we have the word agape, which is the intrinsic kind of love. The Greeks used all of these terms, specific words for love, when they were trying to convey a specific idea. But in English, how many words do we have for love? 1. Love, 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 love. It can apply in all of those same different scenarios, but what we do, instead of having multiple words for love, we just put a different adjective in front of the word love. So instead of having a word for romantic love or agape love, we just say, well, it's romantic love or it's brotherly love. We just change the adjective in front of the word love. But Greek has all of these different words. How do you translate that? Well, you might have to add in adjectives. You might have to say brotherly love for people to get the concept. The target language may not have a corresponding word. How do you translate wheat in an area where wheat doesn't grow? I mean, there's some parts of the world, somebody may want a Bible, They've never heard of wheat. They have no idea what that is. Wheat doesn't grow in Antarctica. I'm not sure there's people there either, but if the penguins are reading their Bible, how do you convey the idea of wheat? Do you just substitute the word grain? Do you say barley or oats? What do? You want to convey the biblical notion, but these people aren't going to understand it if they don't have a word in their language that corresponds. Monetary units, measurements, weights. What in the world is a denarius? Do you substitute dollars for that? Or do you substitute peso for a denarius? If you do, that might help the reader understand the monetary measurement, but you'll give the impression that the things that were happening either recently or they were happening in his own geographical area. So what do? Well, most of the time, what translators do is they keep the biblical word denarius and they put a footnote beside it. And the footnote will tell you, well, a denarius is money worth a laborer's daily wage. Okay. Mary Gail, would you mind reading that for us? No, I'm kidding. You don't have to do that. Okay. All right. This is the Latin Vulgate translation of Matthew 11 and verse 5. Don't turn there. Close your Bible. Don't turn to Matthew 11. We're going to do a little exercise together, okay? How many of you know Latin? Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay? But, even though you don't know Latin, you can figure out what this says. If you're a translator and you come upon words that you don't know, how can you figure out the meaning? How can you figure out what to use in your translation? Context of the passage can help. So what we have here in Matthew 11:5 is a series of contrasting pairs. Contrasting, opposite pairs. I have highlighted some of the words that you can probably make sense of. Okay? Now, so let's start with this and let's figure out how to translate Matthew 11:5 from Jerome's Latin Vulgate. Take the first one here. Chechi, and weedent. Excuse me, it should be chechi. Chechi and weedent. Okay, weedent. Do you see anything there that might tip you off as to what that word might be?
I'm thinking of like vida, like life.
Okay, interesting. Different root word though. All right, so let's take the good idea. Let's take off the NT and put an O in. What do you have then? Video. What do you do with a video? You watch it. Watch. You see it. Okay? So that's the word see. And remember, these are opposite, contrasting pairs. What does chechi mean? If weedent means seeing, what does chechi mean? Blind. The blind now see. Okay? All right, ambulant. What do you see there? Walking. Yeah, you see the word ambulance, which is a vehicle that picks you up and transports you somewhere. Ambulatory, if someone is ambulatory, they're walking. All right, so if we know what that word means, then what does the other word mean? What does cloudy mean? Paralyzed or lame. The lame walk. Okay, the next one's easy. Leprosy. Okay, leprosy. Yeah, but what does mundantur mean?
Well,
Cleansed. Yeah, all right. The lepers have been cleansed. Mundantur is cleansed. All right. Audient. What do you see there? Hearing, audi, auditorium, audience. All right, so audi means hearing, which means surdi must mean what? The deaf. All right, the deaf hear. Mortui. Death. Yeah, you see mortician, mortuary, okay, a place where dead people congregate. If mortui means dead, resurgent must mean raised up, right? It's opposite contrasts. Okay, and then the last two, you can probably figure out both of those. Pauperous, poor, yes, and evangelizantur looks a lot like the word evangelism, which is a transliteration, okay? All right, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. All right, good. Once again, it clicked ahead a little too far. Sorry about that. Okay. Hey, you guys know Latin. How about that? You did better than you thought you would, huh? All right. The poor have the gospel preached to them. Okay, good job. See, that was fun, wasn't it? You guys could translate from Jerome's Vulgate into English. Well done. All right. In 1885, a man named Joseph Henry Thayer, who was a Greek scholar, wrote a Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament. Do you know what a lexicon is? A lexicon is a dictionary of ancient words, ancient languages. So you're reading through Homer, or you're reading through the Greek New Testament and you come across this Greek word, you'd like to investigate it a little more, you don't know what it means. So you can go to an English Greek lexicon and these really smart scholars will tell you, hey, this Greek word, it means this, okay? So it's an old dictionary. Now, Thayer published his Greek-English lexicon in 1885, and at the time it was considered to be the premier lexicographical work of the New Testament. It's now been replaced by newer works that have better access to Greek manuscripts and things, but for some basic Greek work, it's still a useful book. In his book, Thayer compiled a list of languages, a list of words that were used in the New Testament, but he could not find any secular uses of those same words. So that kind of led to this idea of what was referred to as Holy Ghost Greek. The Holy Spirit just invented words and put them into the New Testament documents because we can't find any profane or secular sources that use these same words. Years and years later, troves of historical documents were discovered by archaeologists that found that, no, the Holy Spirit didn't invent any words. All of those words were found among secular authors after Thayer wrote his lexicon, okay? But among those words that were not used, they didn't realize at the time, these words that were not used anywhere in profane sources was this term, logea. Greek word that's only used 2 times in the New Testament, in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, and it's translated collection. So this is that passage where Paul instructs the Corinthians to take up the collection. And then he says in verse 2, and do this so that there be no collections, plural, when I come. Right? We're familiar with that passage. Logea. Thayer said, I can't find this word in any other Greek secular sources. The Holy Spirit just made up this word. Now, if you're Mr. Thayer, how do you give a definition to a word that you can't find any matching uses anywhere else? This is the only use of the term that he has. How can he possibly figure out the definition? Well, Mr. Thayer correctly defined this word. His definition of this is, quote, a collection of money gathered for the relief of the poor. That's exactly what a logea is. And years later, when all of these historical secular documents were discovered, the word logea was used hundreds of times, and how was it used? In reference to a collection of money gathered to relieve poor people. How did Thayer know that? The context of the passage told him that. The context of a passage. So Paul says to the Corinthians, as I ordered the churches of Galatia, so must you do also. On the first day of the week, when you come together, every man take up a something, okay? Take up a something as he may prosper, money, prosperity. Take up something from people as they prosper. I mean, context led him to say, it must be talking about some kind of collection of funds. All right? So sometimes the translators will come across words that they don't know what they mean. What do? You use the context as best you can. Now, Mr. Thayer also had other New Testament references to this same collection. Romans 15, 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9 talks about this same thing. It doesn't use the word collection, but it does talk about funds being given to help poor saints in Jerusalem. It just doesn't use the word lagea. Thayer put all of that information together, and he figured out this is what the word means. And he got it exactly right. Okay. Translating. Lots of fun. So here's where we're going to go next. We're going to talk about specific translations that you can find on the shelves. We're going to talk about the good, the bad, the happy, and the sad. And listen, when you start talking about translations, it's kind of like talking about someone's child. You know, this one's cute and that one's ugly, and you don't want to go there. Well, I'm going to go there. I'm going to talk about, I'm an equal opportunity criticizer, okay? No translation is perfect, but some are much closer than others, and we'll talk about some different ones. Here's what I need from you. Are there any specific translations of the Bible that you want me to talk about? Already, I am planning to talk about what we consider the standard translations, which would be American Standard, New American Standard, King James, New King James, English Standard. I'll talk about those. I'll talk about the NIV. You got any other ones you want me to talk about?
Including modern ones?
Including modern ones, yes.
I'd like to hear your thoughts about the message.
Yeah, I have some thoughts about that. Okay? All right.
New Living Translation.
New Living, okay. All right, good. Yeah, we can talk about that one. Any other ones? The Christian Standard, yeah, okay, good. I'll write these down. Now, I can't, obviously, I'm not going to talk about the history of all these translations like I did the King James Version. That's important history. The history of some of these newer translations is not anywhere close to being exciting like the King James is. But yeah, we'll talk about some of these other ones. So let's see, New Living, Christian Standard, the Message. Any other ones? Okay. The Good News for Modern Man. Yeah, that one's kind of, everybody's kind of forgotten about that one, I think. But, okay, very good. All right, you guys got any questions or comments about anything we talked about today? Can you appreciate the work of translators a little more? It's pretty difficult, right? All right, very good. Well, hey, whatever time we have left, you can have it. Thanks.